Well, how's it going, everybody? Happy Friday to all of you, and thanks for joining me for this masterclass. We are going to be looking at watercolor today, emulation of watercolor in Photoshop. Now, in the past, I've talked to you all about emulating watercolor very easily in Adobe Fresco because, of course, in Fresco we have the live watercolor brushes. Now, those allow the paint to stay wet, and that makes a big difference. And of course, people have asked, will those brushes make their way over to Photoshop? I can't answer that question. What I can tell you is that emulating watercolor in Photoshop is actually not so bad. It's actually quite an easy thing to do. And I'm going to show you today how to do it. Bear with me 1 second. I have to iron out one little technical difficulty I'm having with my stream. So I'm going to be back in just a minute. So please bear with me. Hang on a minute. Alrighty, sorry about that, folks. Here we go. Looks like we're having some issues with the stream on Behance. I'm not sure what's going on there, but on YouTube, things seem to be going okay. So for those of you who are watching over on YouTube, thanks for joining me, and I'm glad that you're able to see what I'm doing. So we'll keep this going because it will be archived and recorded. All right, so first things first. Emulating watercolor in Photoshop comes down to a few simple ingredients. The first of those, of course, being the most important, is brushes. Brushes are a big deal. Brushes matter, obviously. So let's talk about your options for brushes. Now, those of you who have a Photoshop subscription, all you have to do is pop over here to your brushes menu. And you'll notice in the top right corner, there is a teeny tiny little drop down menu. Now, just to be clear, this is not the brush settings menu, it's the brushes menu. And if I tap on that, I can come on down to this get more brushes. When I do that, you'll see that this page is going to give you the option to sign in to download. If you sign in with your Adobe ID and password, what will happen is you'll be taken to a page with over 1,900 different brushes conveniently organized and collected into different brush sets. And you just download those. And when you download them, all you have to do is double click on them to wherever you've saved them, and they should automatically install right into your brush list in Photoshop. Now, if for some reason double clicking to install them doesn't work, don't worry. You need simply come to that same drop-down menu and come here where it says import brushes, and you will then navigate on your computer to where you have downloaded those ABR files. Those are your Photoshop brush files. And you'll then be able to import them. Now you'll see here that I have way too many brushes. So it is. I spend a lot of time making them, so they wind up piling up. But I will tell you that in the last few years, I would say computers with the new CPUs and everything, it's okay to have 1,000 or more brushes loaded at one time when you're using Photoshop. It's likely not going to slow things down tremendously. But if you want to trim it all down to, maybe fewer than 400, 500, you may do so. But I don't think you're going to see a big difference in performance. What you will see, of course, is a big long list of brush sets, and I've even got them all organized in folders and so on, and it's still just massive. Nevertheless, check this out. You can now search for brushes. And so if I type watercolor, look how convenient that is. Just pops up in my Real Watercolor brush set. There we go. And here are the brushes I'm looking for. for today's demo. So for you to get these brushes, like I said, you go and you log in with your credentials on that website, you load up the watercolor brushes, and we're going to look at those today and see how to use them for watercolor emulation. That's ingredient one. The second ingredient we want to talk about today is paper. Yes, you're working digitally, and we know that, but one of the things that makes watercolor really look like watercolor is oftentimes the paper texture showing through the color in the paint. Because as you know, watercolor is not really an opaque medium. It's more of a transparent medium. And because of that transparency, whatever you paint the watercolors onto, whatever surface you're painting onto, the texture will come through and be visible depending on the transparency of the paint, right? And so that's going to make a big difference in selling this look of watercolor for everybody. And I know that it can be frustrating when you're working on just a plain white background, even using excellent brushes, but not getting that paper texture to come through the way you want. So anyway, let's take a look at what a difference paper makes. And we're going to do that in two different ways. We're going to start by having paper set as the background layer, the bottom layer for my illustration today. And the way I did this was, if we just pop over here, you'll see I have this file. I'm going to zoom in on that so you can look really closely at it. It's got a lot of nice texture. And if you're wondering where you can get this paper file, you can get it for free right at my Gumroad page, okay? So if you're looking for a nice free paper texture, go to gumroad.com/Kyle T. Webster. And there you're going to find a file called Kyle's Perfect Paper. And you just go ahead and grab that. You can download it for no money at all. Just make sure you enter a little 0 in the payment box there so you get it for free. And it'll come with 3 variations of this paper texture, a light, a medium, and a dark. And I find it useful for overlaying over illustrations when you're done with them, with different blending modes, layer blending modes, to give it just a little bit of oomph at the end, but also for purposes like this, putting it at the bottom of something. That is fine as well. Alrighty, so that is where that came from. And I just pasted it here into my document and cropped it down. It's actually got a mask around it. I'll show it what it looks like at 100%. Now what I've done here is I pulled up my hue and saturation sliders. And the original images are all in grayscale. So I just went and I used the colorize option right here. I tapped on colorize and I adjusted it so it had a little bit of color to it. And then what I did was I just knocked the opacity back 15 or 20%. Okay, so there it is. It's sitting there. It's very, very faint, but it will make a difference when we paint. Okay. Now let's talk more about brushes. So as you know in Photoshop, I said this before, the paints do not stay wet. And if the paints don't stay wet, that means that once you have applied a mark on your canvas, on your document, well, what happens is that mark is fixed. It is permanent. So I'm sorry folks, I'm just checking to see if Behance is working right now. I'm still not seeing anything, but yes, it looks like it's working. Hey everybody, nice to see you. Thanks for being patient there. I appreciate it. Okay, so back to the brushes. Yeah, so the marks that you make cannot stay wet and they cannot be played around with or mixed with later on down the road. But there's a way to work around that, and I'm going to show you the methods that I use. Okay, and they're not so bad. They work pretty well. So we're going to crack open this Real Watercolor brush set here, and on the Adobe website they're just called Watercolors, so you know what to look for. Okay, and the file that you download will say Kyle Real Watercolor. And what I want to do is skip down to these numbered brushes here, these 4, 5, and 6. All right, I'm just going to select number 5 for now. Okay. And I want to show you what's unique about these brushes. I'm going to come over here. And you'll notice that I've got a very basic set of watercolors, the hues that you can get watercolors in. Of course, there are many more colors in this, but these are sort of the ones you would expect to find in any basic set. And another thing I think that makes your job a little easier is using colors that people are familiar with and that you'll be familiar with if you're using watercolor in the physical world with real paint, instead of trying to just blindly rely on random color picking in your color wheel. And I've done another masterclass on this topic, which is the importance of understanding how to simplify working with color in a digital environment. So having these basic colors really makes it easier, and you can just go and find a sampling of colors altogether, little swatches that come with any watercolor set. You can find images of these on Google and then just copy them down if you like. All right, so that's a little tip for you all. But I'm just going to grab this permanent rose here. And I'm going to, whoops, let me go here. Make a new layer. I'm just going to put some color down. Now, one thing you'll notice if I just make a basic stroke here, paint, with these is, one, they have a built-in paper texture. So this is very handy if you are going to just paint on white. Okay. Second, you're going to notice that the edges are slightly irregular, but they also have a slightly darker tint to them at the edges of, or the borders of, the area that you paint. Not everywhere. It'll show up here and there. Okay. And that is another thing that adds to the realism of these paints. Okay. Using very light pressure, you'll see that I can even get a very, very faint little splotch of color there. And a lot of that paper texture will show through. The other thing to note is that the mode, the brush mode for these is set to multiply. Okay. And multiply means that every time I paint a new stroke on top of another area, it's going to make whatever is underneath, or what I'm painting on top of, darker. So if I change my color to something like a bluish sort of violet color like this, okay, and I paint over this pinkish red here, you can see what it does to the color underneath. And part of the reason for using this mode is because, again, watercolor is a transparent medium. And as long as you're not using the paint straight out of the tube, you're using a little bit of water, as we usually do with these paints, you're going to have this kind of effect when you paint a wash of color over another area that has already dried, okay? And so knowing that they behave this way, you can plan accordingly when you're doing your painting, okay? So what you'll find is the majority of brushes in this set, and there are about 160 brushes in this set, it's very large, take advantage of what I just showed you, this sort of wet edge, using multiply as a brush mode. So if I go to the natural edge painter, for example, I'll use the number 2 here. And we'll just grab this nice blue color. This one has a rougher edge, but still gets some darkening qualities here and there. You can see what happens when I lay it down like that. This one also responds to pen tilt and rotation. And I don't mean barrel rotation when I say that, not like the Wacom Art Pen, but the rotation of my wrist, okay, to change the angle of the brush when I'm painting. And I can do that mid-stroke for different effects. Now what I like about this one is it gets a little lighter as I continue to paint my shape. as if it's drying in real time. And watercolor do dry lighter than when you first put them down. And so you're going to get that same effect here. But what I like too is that I can come in here and start to darken this edge, but then I can use light pressure and just kind of blend that area into the original color. Now where you're going to find it's harder to extend shapes you've already painted, okay, because of this multiply mode, right? So if I come here and I just lightly touch that area, I can try to control it where you don't see a sort of a border between the two areas that I painted. But what's going to happen is you will see that first shape kind of sticking out, and sometimes I'll try and make up for that by adding another little hit close to the edge, close to the border, like this, until eventually it just looks like a shape that's part of the interior of the overall shape. Okay, so that is one way. You see the result there? That is one way to work around that problem, is using this brush, like the natural edge or brushes that are similar to it, that will give you that ability to add to a shape and then slowly darken an area close to where the edge of that shape, the original shape, the border of the original shape was, to try and get around that. And you're going to get these nice textures everywhere, and it just makes it feel more natural. However, if you don't want to do that, let me show you the other workaround. And this is a very common one that people use, and I find it to be pretty effective. So I'll use some cadmium red here. And let's go to a different brush. We'll use a round 80. Here we go. And I'll put down a shape like this, a sort of a rectangular shape. And then right next to it, I'll put another rectangular shape. All right, now in doing so, you can see that I wind up with this overlap area here. Now, if I want all of this to be one solid block of color, okay, here is something you can do. In this watercolor set, you're going to find some blenders. What I mean by that is smudge tools. They'll be all the way down at the bottom, okay? If I use this soft edger 1 or soft edger 2, I'll go ahead and use this soft edger 2. It's a smudge tool, right? So I'm just going to gently smudge this area that's darker, kind of push that around until those two areas are sort of nicely blended. Now you say, but Kyle, that looks terrible. Where's the paper texture? So this is where we bring in an extra helpful brush, which is the Add Paper Texture brush. And you will find that at the top here of the list. Here it is. Add Paper Texture. Now, let's zoom in here for a moment. What I like to do for this brush is sample the color that I've just blended and paint with it, okay, to add that paper texture. Make it a little smaller. And that just adds in the paper texture that we took away when we did the smudging. I wound up getting a little big with that there, so that's okay. Let's just erase it. And then I've wound up blending those two areas together using smudge, then adding the paper texture to make everything look a little more unified at the end of the day. And that's a really easy way to add to a shape that you painted. Now, what I recommend doing when emulating watercolor using brushes like this in Photoshop is to do this as little as possible by planning ahead and saying, here is an area, a shape that I know I want to paint, and then trying to basically paint it in one shot, more or less. Of course, if you want to lift up your stylus and you know you're going to come back down again with the stylus to add more color, I then recommend using lighter pressure to scrub a little bit at the edge of the area where you're going to be adding paint. Let me show you what I mean. So, grab this Viridian. we'll use that natural painter again. So imagine that I'm going to paint a shape like a triangle here, and I start painting it, and I say, okay, I've got this, and then I decide, oh, I'm about to just run out of steam. I want to pick this up in a minute. So I'm just lightly kind of scrubbing around here, so it's going to make that area lighter. Then I can lift my stylus up, and I come back to apply more paint. And the area that I'm blending into, because it's lighter than what was in the main body of the painting towards the back left, makes it easier for me then to add that paint there and not worry so much about that overlapping effect being a problem. I just made my brush smaller here, by the way, so I could sort of refine this. I could come out here to this edge. And I don't worry about stuff like these little dark areas because I just come over them and scrub a little bit and they sort of go away. This is the kind of thing, by the way, it's difficult to explain or even show you until you have picked up a stylus yourself and started to use these brushes, because then you'll get a feel for how they add and simultaneously subtract paint depending on how you're scrubbing with the stylus. All right. So let's see if we have any questions here. None so far, but if you do have any questions, please use the Behance chat to ask them. That's be.net/live. Behance.net/live. That's where I'm following the chat. All right, so those are some basics right there. I think now let's look at what we've done here. We've added this little bit of paper to paint on. And the easiest thing to do is to set a layer above it to multiply. So here, my layer blend mode, I'm going to set it to multiply. So that everything I paint over here, right, is going to have that paper texture coming through in addition to the paper texture that's in the brush. And that just gives me an extra hit of lovely texture. And it will go a long way towards selling the look of the painting. However, I want to point out something that you'll find helpful. Once you paint, okay, if I come over here to sample this color, all right, remember that whatever I'm sampling is taking into account the paper that's underneath it. So it will change that color slightly from what I think I'm using. One thing I like to do, of course, is have these colors out here so I can always grab them in their pure state if I want to reuse them, just like I would with Real Watercolor. But another thing you can do is this. I'll hide this for a moment. You can paint to your heart's content with your watercolors on plain old white background, okay? And then when you're all done with your painting and you want that last little extra hit of paper texture or whatever, you can add it later. You can then, okay, bring this in here. So there's my paper. So I can paint everything with white. Then I can bring the paper in. And then I can duplicate that layer. This is my paper layer here. I hit Command J. That will duplicate everything on the layer. And I just bring it up to the top of my document. And I set its mode to something like overlay or color burn. One of those or those are good. Both of those. Okay, and I'll knock it back to like 15% or something like that. Knock my original paper down to like 10%, so it's really, really light. And then I'm going to have all this extra nice paper texture goodness over everything. It's very subtle, but it is there. And that's another way to do it where you don't want to be concerned with sampling color from your document while you're painting that isn't as pure as what you sampled to originally start making those marks with your brush. Okay. Okay, so let us explore some options that we have here. First, the basics. So the brushes I've been showing you are kind of the basics for painting what I would call hard-edged shapes. And I'm going to make my paper a little brighter because I think on the stream it's a little hard to see. And I want to make sure you can all see this. There we go. What about soft edge shapes? Watercolors, of course, you can create hard edge shapes and soft edge shapes by using water to soften the edge of something. Well, as you may have guessed, you can still use these hard-edged brushes. Okay, so let's go back to, let's say, one of these numbered ones. Let's do number 4. So, of course, sorry about that, painting directly on the paper. There we go. So, of course, I can paint. And then I could, to soften this area here, just go ahead and use my smudge tool. That's one way to do it. We know that one of the downsides to using this method is, although I'm getting a little bit of texture coming through because I'm using multiply, I do lose a little bit of it here with the smudge, right? But that is one option. Now, to solve that problem, of course, we use our little add paper texture, so I pop up there. And I can always just add a little bit of paper texture there if I think that's going to help. All right, but that's one way to get a softer edge shape, which is very natural for how watercolors behave. But another thing you can do is you can use brushes that have softer edges, and there are many of them. The Big Wet Wash Bleed, for example, will give you this kind of a lovely effect where you get a very nice soft edge. And I use a darker color here so you can see how I can blend those together and get these really soft, cloudy watercolor effects here. All right. So combining this, for example, with another brush would make it possible to get the best of both worlds, especially if you go ahead and do a little blending between the two, or a little smudging, right? So that's one thing. Use a soft edge brush. And there are, you know, quite a few of these. There's a variant of this one called Wet Wash Bleed 2. And that one, you'll see, I can get a harder edge shape with more pressure, and then I can soften it with less pressure, like that. Pretty neat. If I were to take a harder edged brush, like this 2017 Basic, and paint the beginnings of an area here, and then just go softer, 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 less pressure here. Okay. And then come back to this Big Wet Wash Bleed brush, make it a little smaller, and hit it here at the edge, and go really soft, like this. Then I can take my smudge tool, and I can make that transition a little smoother right there. And now I've got a nice hard edge shape here, transitioning to a soft edge shape there. And I like sometimes painting on top of these shapes with another more textural brush. And you'll find these brushes called Stain. Here we go. Stain Damp Paper, Stain Control, Stain Damp Paper 3, right? So just adding a bit of stain to these. Very subtle, but look what that does here and here. Okay, So let's look before. Here's before. Here's after. What that gives me is just a little bit of juice. A little bit of those cool drying patterns you get with watercolors that are random, and they're one of the things that makes watercolors beautiful to look at, is these sort of happy accidents that occur in the drying of the paint, and also just in the application of the paint. If you're doing it in a nice loosey-goosey way, you're going to get some pretty nifty things happening like this. So a way to achieve that is to use these stain damp paper brushes, or the stain control brush. Used on its own, it also creates some very nice washy effects, as you can see there. But I really like to sort of gently use those to scrub on top of an area that I've already painted to give it just a little extra watercolor vibe. All right, now let's see here. Any questions from all our friends who are watching in the chat? Yum, the edges. Yeah, they are yummy, huh? Like a fluffy blue bunny, somebody said. I think that's a cool thing to think about. A fluffy blue bunny. It is like a fluffy blue bunny, isn't it? Something like that, maybe. See, I'm just smudging those together. And by having the paper there underneath and using this multiply mode, it just makes that so easy to do, you know? And make my brush really small. Just do that. See? Very watercolory. If there is such a word. Let's just pretend that there is. I could cheat too, and I could use my lasso tool here. Just get rid of all that. That's kind of a fun thing to do, to use the lasso tool with your brushes, and then you can smudge some areas to create an irregular edge wherever you want, right? There is a spider spread blend. I know that's a weird name, but you might want to try that one too. That does some nifty things with spreading out your paint as well. Recommend trying that. Now you remember a moment ago I did that stain action. So here I just come back over it, do a little staining, set it to multiply, and we'll get even more kind of nice. There's some cool stuff happening there. See that? There's our little bunny. There you go. Watercolor emulation in Photoshop. It can be done, and it can be done with very little effort and with very nice results. Megan, thank you for that bunny suggestion. That worked out nicely. All right, so bunny, we're going to move you over there. Let's look at what else you can do. Now, in addition to those basic brushes, and you've seen how they behave, there's a special category of brushes in the watercolor brushes, and it is called Wamazing. Wamazing, like the word amazing. And these brushes are a little hard to explain, but I'll do my best. I think, again, the best thing for you to do is to try them out so you can see what you can do with them. So we're going to start with the Wamazing basic brush, okay? And I'll go ahead and grab a different color here. Now you've seen in me do with the other brushes this thing that's an additive and negative kind of behavior, all with a single brush stroke. The key is that I'm maintaining contact with the surface of my tablet using my stylus. The Wamazing brushes take this idea much further, and they actually make it possible for you to not only add paint, but to actually completely remove it if you're careful, all in one stroke. And it might seem strange that we would want to do this, but I'll show you why this is useful. First, I can paint a shape, and then look at this. I'm just lightly scrubbing over this area until it just goes away. I come over here and do the same thing. The key is I'm not lifting up the stylus in order to achieve this. Not lifting it up. This all happened in one long go. All right? So what's cool about this is I can remove the paint, but then I can come back in here and I can just add it again. And then I can, around the edges, scrub it away, add it again, around the edges, scrub it away. See what I mean? Add it and scrub until it's gone. So this gives you some pretty interesting options here. Now, if I paint and just lift up my stylus, well, of course, that mark is there and it's not going anywhere. If I paint, maintain contact, come back, I can make it more faint all the way through, like that. Very interesting. Maybe I want to make this bigger, so I'll come along the edge here and remove some of what I just painted there, and then add a bit more. Move a bit. Do some pretty weird, wonky things with this brush. All of the Wamazing brushes share this strange property. You can do this with all of them. They still are working in multiply mode, so they will darken whatever is underneath them when you paint with them. What I like best about these, though, is the ability. Oops, I like that little bunny. I want to keep him there. What I like best about these is their ability to vary the edges of the shape that I paint. Okay, so the little triangle. Paint all that in there. Then come back out here and just kind of remove some bits and pieces from that corner, and maybe over here just for a second, like that. I like being able to do that, and you can't do that with any other brushes. The Wamazing brushes are standalone weird brushes that can do this, and this just adds a bit of realism to the watercolors that you paint, because this is the kind of thing that happens with watercolor. You sometimes get these areas that just don't dry as opaque, or opaquely, is that a word, as others. And so that's pretty nifty. All right, what else do we have? There's a bristle version of this brush. It's got some bristly patterns to it. And of course, do the same thing. You can just scrub it and remove paint. Not quite to the extreme that you can do with the other one there. But I really like this for giving a different brush stroke quality to what you paint, right? There's a Wamazing dry brush. Very different edge quality to it, as you can see. So the edges of the shapes you paint will, of course, not be as crystal clear. Now let's take a close look at that. That really looks like the kind of thing you get with watercolor on like a pulpy paper, the way it's drying irregularly like that, and the way the edge looks. You can do some very believable wet media effects with these brushes. And if I want to, I can always smudge some of it, right? Soften it. Then come back over with that same color. Some of these have a mode set to normal, so I'll just make it multiply if I want to add a bit of grain and texture over the area that I'm just painting. Right? There's a gritty one, like that. Lots of texture. Check these out, give them a try. You'll find ways to use these, I'm sure. Actually, some of you are probably familiar with Christoph Niemann. He's a brilliant artist and illustrator and thinker. He's done some really lovely silkscreen prints using the Wamazing brushes. We have two of them in our house of the Eiffel Tower that he just does some pretty clever things with those brushes. Check out his stuff. All right, I also wanted to show you, here we go, some very handy brushes for larger effects. And those of you who've seen my little posts on Instagram and everything else I've done over the years, I oftentimes will just start with a shape and then I'll turn it into something like we did with this bunny, thanks to the audience suggestion there. But this is the kind of thing I love, is just to be able to put down a little shape like that. This is the soft irregular wash variant. And at 100%, this is what it looks like. And it does get some nice sort of stainy bits in there. And you never know what's going to happen out at the edges either. And there are different brushes like it, and you can combine them for different effects. Like this. So for those of you who are into the more sort of drop some paint on the paper and let it pool and let it do weird things, you're going to get some nice results with these. And you can always do this clever trick of painting and erasing with the same brush by using, if you have an American keyboard, the tilde key on your tilde looks like this on your keyboard. You hold that down on any of the later versions of Photoshop, and what it allows you to do is use a brush as an eraser, right? So I'll often do this. I'll put some paint down and then come back in and maybe remove some of it using exactly the same brush, right? So all those properties of the brush are retained, texture and whatnot. Okay, but I can do this nice sort of additive subtractive thing. I go back and forth till I get something neat. This can be really great for painting clouds, as I'm sure you would have already figured out. But yeah, if I want to paint a little sky, and you know how with watercolor, white is not something you typically paint unless you're using gouache. White is what comes through by leaving the paper exposed, right? So for me to do a little cloudy sky like this, or a sky with clouds in it, it's not what I would call a cloudy sky. you know, that's easy enough to just let that white of the paper come through here and there to give us our little cloud shapes. And I'll go ahead and leave that like that, and then I could come in with a different brush to paint a little ground. I'm looking for something that has more of a visible bristle kind of look to it. Although I do like this rough and tumble. I haven't used that one in a while. It's a nice one. See that? Very watercolory. Again, I'm just gonna use that word all day. What the heck? It doesn't matter. I'm sure it's gonna be a real word in a few years maybe. But let's take a close look at that. See how nice that is with that paper and those sort of irregular drying patterns that happen because of the way that brushes are built. I'd say that's pretty convincing. And if you really want to go nuts, you know, go ahead and smudge away some bits in the sky where you just want things to sort of fade out to nothing, right? You keep a few hard edges here and there, a few soft edges, and you're in good shape. Now if I turn on that layer above, I increased the opacity to 40%. Maybe you can see that, although on the stream I'm not sure if you can or cannot. Hopefully you can see it. But that is that last little thing that really makes a huge difference, which is to throw that paper texture on top and set it to a mode like color burn or overlay or what have you. I really want you to notice it makes a huge difference in the believability. If I just knock it up higher, I'll exaggerate it so you can hopefully see it more clearly. Whoops, didn't mean to do that, sorry. There. See what that does? I hope that's coming through. Tell me if it's not. I'm looking for questions to see if we have any questions. Can you all, I think I'm seeing it now, I'm looking at what you all are seeing, and I think it's coming through pretty clearly. So that really makes a difference. When you're finished with your painting, throw that extra layer on top, and just, you know, look at that. If I zoom in here on this area where we have the sky meeting the ground, I think it's pretty convincing, and this is what I like to do. This is what I do when I do digital watercolor in Photoshop. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, and I hope that this has been informative and helpful, and I think it will get people on their way to working with watercolor. Actually, there are two quick things. The first is don't forget how nice it is to use pencil with watercolor. And I don't just mean regular pencil drawing with graphite, because that's very easy to do. Of course, we can use our, oops. Something's going on here with my brushes panel. All right, come on now, behave. It's not letting me close my brushes. First time I've seen that. Well, hopefully I can, nope, I can't close anything. All right. Let's see, can I get to my drawing, the Megapack drawing box? It doesn't look like it. What happened? Oh dear. I know what happened. It's because I was searching for the word watercolor. Silly me. Here in my brushes, I'm gonna just open the drawing pack for just a moment and grab the animator pencil. And I just want to point out that, you know, it's lovely to use pencil with watercolor. I'll pop over here to our watercolors. And you know, the mode is already set to multiply. I can just work on one layer if I want and just do that. You can see how fun it is to use these two mediums together. Very satisfying. All right, that's one thing, but don't forget, take any of your pencils, okay? Animator pencil, doesn't matter which. And use them as colored pencils, because people do that all the time with watercolor. They use colored pencils, right? So go ahead and try using colored pencils with your watercolors, okay? Don't forget to set the mode to multiply so that what you do allows the paint to show through, okay? But that is going to give you some great results. The last thing I wanted to show you, this is great, is blending with watercolors in a natural way. And I've done this with other shows in the past, but just to remind you, set your foreground color and then change your background color to something else. And look what you can do, all in one shot. See that? It's because this brush is taking advantage of color dynamics, and I'm using pen pressure to control how much of the foreground or background color comes through. So if I want to paint a nice sort of violet color like this and have these nice little changes all over the place between red and blue, and the way I achieve that is like this. I'm using foreground and background color together, and you get some pretty cool results. That's the magic of color dynamics, and with watercolor it really works beautifully. It's really neat. Get all these little variations in the color like that. Several of the brushes in there do that. The Color Magic brushes do it. There's some nice variants of that brush, like this one. Sort of more streaky, and get some beautiful colors with that. So there's a cool way to do graded washes or variegated washes if you want to use fancy watercolor lingo. Try out these brushes and use color dynamics to their full potential. And I think you'll enjoy that. That's all the time we have, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for hanging in. Sorry we had a few technical difficulties up front, but we got those resolved. And we learned a lot about watercolor emulation in Photoshop. It's the weekend. Everybody take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Please remember to be kind. I'm not going to be around next week doing any shows. There'll be some replays. I'll be picking things up again in 2 weeks to do more of my draw along, masterclass, and brush hour shows. So I will see you then. Till then, take care. See you soon.